Welcome everyone. Our project is to analyze world economic data and to predict certain factors influencing economy. My name is Chinmay and my teammates are Julian, Prathamesh and Prerna. So here are the goals of our project. So the first goal of our project was to perform explanatory data analysis. EDA basically gives a broad look at the patterns and the trends of the different factors in our data set. Plotting different interactive graphs and drawing summary report gave us a better understanding of each factors. The next step was to identify correlation between different factors. We identified that factors like GDP, infant mortality, literacy, birth rate are highly correlated, and using correlation matrix, you are able to visualize those relationships. Uh, last, uh, Last step was to build different models and to build different model and select the best fitted model for our analysis. Let's talk about data. We pulled our data from Kaggle.com and the dataset name is Countries of the World. This main source of this data is from World Factbook, which is a public domain. So it was very easy for us to retrieve different types of data which we require for our analysis. So the dataset looks like um, this. This is the raw data which we pulled from the fact book. There are different countries, region, population. The data set has 20 different factors, countries, region, population, etc., of 227 different countries. There are three categorical data, country, religion, and as we see, we have considered climate as our categorical data as well. So the countries with climate as value 1 is considered as dry, tropical, tundra, and ice region. The countries with climate as 2 are wet, tropical regions. The country with climate 3 are temperature, humid, subtropical, and regions, whereas the countries with climate as 4 are dry, hot summer, and wet winters. Um, um, and the rest numerical data are gross domestic products per capita, literacy percentage per total population, phone, which we have considered as the technology uses of the countries, arable crops and others are the three categories of land use together gives a percentage of 100. Then there are three sectors of the economy, which is agriculture, industry, and services. Uh, Even the summation of these three sectors gives us 100%. The next step was to clean the data. The first thing we did was we saw that the numerical data were comma separated. We converted this comma separated data into decimal separated data. We fixed this Excel sheet before importing it in our Python for our Python analysis. Uh, Secondly, we found that there were lots of missing data in our data set. So to handle this missing data, we couldn't follow the generalized method like taking the mean or mode value of the column or performing k nearest, since each column represent different countries and these were independent data. Hence, we found few of the datas from the source website of Factbook, World Factbook, and in that process, we realized that we were unable to find few datas of the countries, but these countries were territories of other countries, and the GDP and the population of such countries were not significant. Hence, we decided to eliminate these data from our dataset. Um, Now I'll talk about the libraries which we use. So for data retrieval, we use libraries like NumPy and Pandas. For data visualization and plotting beautiful graphs, we use Seaborn and Plotly. For data scraping, for web scraping, we use Beautiful Soap, and for building our models, we use sklearn and sklearn linear regression models, SciPy for statistical inference. Let's move ahead for exploratory data analysis, and Prerna will talk about exploratory data analysis.
Hello, everyone. I'll be continuing with the exploratory data analysis section. So, we performed exploratory data analysis on the country data that we had, and to understand beyond its size and types of variables. Through our EDA, we found out about the strong relationships between different variables, checked for anomalies and errors. EDA also helped us to get some meaningful insight as to what variables would be more valuable in the model building. So there were three types of analysis that we did: univariate, bivariate, and multivariate. So for univariate, we actually used histogram plot for the numerical data. There were two categorical data that we had in our data set, which we later converted into numerical data. For this data, we used the bar graph. And for bivariate analysis, we used a heat map for correlation matrix, scatter plot, and box plot. And as you can see, we use pair plot for multivariate analysis. So moving on further, I'll talk about the univariate analysis that we did. Here in the slide, you can see a scatter plot between GDP and the other per capita factors. On the right hand side, you're seeing the major inferences that we got from the univariate analysis. We found a bunch of right skewed data. Right skewed is nothing but the data that has its mean greater than the median. So population area, population density, coastline, GDP, which is interpreted as technology, were the right skewed data. Literacy was left skewed. That means it had its median greater than the mean. So we can see from this slide that China has the largest population. That's a known fact, right? And Russia has the largest population density. No, Russia has the largest area, whereas Monaco has the largest population density. Population density being calculated by population divided by area. So infant mortality rate is highest in Angola, and countries like Australia, Denmark, and Finland have highest literacy rate. So we later in the PPT we infer that countries which have highest literacy rate may have highest GDP. Uh, GDP has also a good correlation between literacy rate, phones, which is technology, birth rate, agriculture, and services. So now I will move on to the bivariate analysis. So here you can see the correlation plot. So here we there's all the factors are listed, and we can find out through numbers how much each factor is related with the other. So we can see a couple of them are negatively correlated, like a lot of negative correlation is there between some factors. Chinmay, could you please zoom in a bit?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and could you please go to the correlation graph? Yeah, so here we can find out that yeah, thank you. Phones, that is technology, is related to the GDP and is also related to the negatively related to some factors like birth rate and agriculture. But actually we also need to evaluate and make some educated guesses when we are considering factors. So let's move on to the next page. Yeah. So this is about the population density. Since the just the raw data of population density did not satisfy all the factors of uh, normalization, we had to take the log of the data, and we can say that there is a very slight positive correlation between the two factors. um, and it's only and there's only a very small effect between population density and GDP. Moving on to coastline. So as I told you before, coastline is a categorical data. So we converted the categorical data into numerical data, and countries which do not do have a coastline are represented by 0, and which do not have a coastline are represented by 1. And we can see clearly in the box plot that countries with a coastline have a higher GDP. uh, Moving on to the net migration. So it's clearly visible in the graph that net migration and GDP are highly positively correlated. So controlled migration would help in in GDP is what I infer from this graph, because migration would actually mean that more jobs for the people who migrated in other countries, and more jobs means more economy and higher GDP. Next important factor was literacy, and we see that many countries have a very good literacy rate, and hence they're having higher GDP. Moving ahead, we have another important factor, that is, I would like to talk about technology now. So if we just move ahead a bit, so we can see the graph for technology. That is nothing but phones. So it's a very valid, understandable point that if the country is developed and has better economy, so the people who are in that country are literate and they would like to use more technology, which is a small representation is phones here. So hence, more technology usage and more phone usage is there in countries which have higher GDP, so it's positively correlated. So moving on with birth rate factors like birth rate, death rate, all of these are something which depends upon the health facilities in a country. So countries which have good GDP are countries which have better facilities and better medical probably reliefs and all that. So if there are better medical facilities, the mortality rate will definitely be less, and like they can definitely tackle outbreaks, so death rate would also be less. So moving on to some last factors like industry, we don't see that there's any significant relationship. And yeah, definitely we should talk about service, because service is positively correlated to GDP. And services like trade and providing jobs, which countries government do, uh, prove that they have a better GDP. So moving on to agriculture. So agriculture has a negative correlation, but what I infer from the project that agriculture and GDP are not actually very significantly correlated. So we may infer that developing countries may depend on their agriculture to make money and export their products. So that might be a cause. Agriculture might be a cause for countries where they are developing, but not for developed countries, because they may actually export products, export crops from outside. So developed countries may more depend on services. So next we'll just move on to climate. uh, so from the graph, it's very clear that countries with a temperate, humid, and tropical climate have more GDP. There are some exceptions with wet tropical regions. So, wet tropical regions are nothing but regions with more precipitation, and the outliers that we see in the graph actually support that point. So, there might be some countries like which have wet tropical climate, like Indonesia and all. They might be surviving on their agriculture and the export of fruits or vegetation that they're doing. So that might be contributing to a higher GDP. So the last thing I'll be talking about is the multivariate graphs. This is a graph that we have plotted using a pair plot, and it has its regions here. So we see that the Western European region has a very high GDP. Factors which support that are literacy, technology, which I just spoke about. So there is Western European countries regions have higher literacy rate, have higher um, uh, usage of technology, and like have good services, and hence their GDP is high. And there are some factors that were there in our raw data. They were actually agriculture, industry, and services. They collectively may contribute for a good GDP. That's what we inferred from this multivariate graph. Next, Julian will be talking about the energy efficiency and data scaling.
Hello, everyone. So, after the data analysis, we decided to build some regression models. And the first regression model we built was based on a study conducted by Cohen ID in 2014. Uh, in this research, he built a regression model to predict energy consumption based on economic and demographic factors. So basically, what he is explaining there is like he construct like a regression model to predict energy consumption on the basis of GDP and population. So we kind of reply this same model for our project, because we didn't have in our data set the energy consumption variable. We did data scraping using the Beautiful Soup package for parsing the HTML document. So since we knew our source, the main source for the data that was the World Fat Book from the CIA website, we took the data from there. So basically, the code we uh, wrote the result is a data frame that contains the list of the countries with their energy consumption. What we did then was to merge this data frame with our data frame, and from there we just selected the columns we needed to build the different regression models. In this case, we select energy consumption, GDP, and population. However, in our dataset, GDP is actually GDP per capita, so we have to create a new column uh, that actually there is the actual GDP, that is GDP per capita times population, and with that new column we build our model. So going to the next slide, we can see the model. Please, Chimay, can you? So we build this model, and when we build the model the first time, we check the assumptions. We discover the model didn't meet the regression model assumptions. So what we did then was to do a transformation log for all those variables and then build that model again. So here what you can see is the new model with the data expressing in the new form in log transformation. So from this model, we obtain that the adjusted R square is 0.92. That basically what explains is like 92% of the variability in energy consumption log can be explained by population log and GDP log. So for this model, we were able to check assumptions, and all assumptions were met. So we went ahead to keep this model, and we could see the details of this model in our Python code. So going forward for our next model, so how Purana explained before, we had a correlation matrix, and from that correlation matrix, we were able to determine how the different factors were correlated. So from there, we conclude that we could predict literacy on the basis of GDP, infant mortality, funds, average rate. We build this model and check the assumptions, We obtain an adjusted R squared of 0.78 that basically explains like 79% of the variability in literacy can be explained by infant mortality, GDP, funds, and birth rate. So how I told before, so the assumptions for this model were met, and so we that was like our confirmation that this model was a good option to predict literacy for these countries. So going to the next model, the other model we built was to predict infant mortality on the basis of GDP, literacy, agriculture, birth rate, and funds. So same way, we calculate the model for this regression, and we obtain an adjusted R squared of 0.70 that basically explains that 70% of the variability in literacy can be explained by infant mortality, GDP, funds, and birth rate. So also assumptions for this regression model were checked and met, and we with that we validate this was a good model. So now Pratamish is going to finish and explain the fourth model.
All right. So thank you, Julian. And yeah, I would like to say that after the intense EDA analysis and building all these models, we again did like a basic heat map of the variables that were present, and we actually figured out like, okay, we have few categorical variables and few non-categorical or like discrete variables which are like not which are, some of them are like correlated as well. So we made a decision like to convert our categorical variable to indicator variables. For example, we had coastline, so we converted coastline and to like indicator variable of 0 and 1s. And we also had climate. We had like four climatic uh, categories. So we actually converted every category to indicator variable. And then after realizing that, okay, few of the variables are not actually making any sense, like arable and arable crops and other named variable, then we decided to not consider those variables in making model for predicting GDP. So after that, uh, we predicted model based on these factors, and we like actually that model was not so successful because we actually got the variability of about like 60%. And then we checked it for normal linear regression assumptions, and we figured out that there were many variables which were like responsible for multicollinearity as well as heteroscedasticity, and it was like which were like making our variability low compared to what we should have got. So we actually did educated guesses on removing some multicollinear factors, like some other variables which were similar to the variables. And based on p-value, we also calculated significant variables which were not which were not in the final model. So based on the final model, we only had like net migration, infant mortality, literacy, phone as a technology, services, population, coastline, and climate. These four variables as our predictor variables, and based on that, we got the uh, like we got about 90% of variability, which was explained by by this variables against GDP. So can you go to next slide, Chinmay? Yeah. So we got about, yeah, as I said, 90% of variability was explained. And I also try to incorporate k-means method to cluster this variables to predict GDP. But as we see the data, we could see that there was only one. I mean, we could, as we know that clustering in k-means takes place using Euclidean distance, and if you see the data, there was only one factor we could think of clustering data that was based on regions. So it doesn't make sense that how region and GDP is correlated, and how clustering will predict GDP, because clustering is based on K means, and whereas regions have different factors affecting the GDP. So yeah, can you go to the next slide, Chinmay? So yeah, based on what we calculated, we figure out that GDP is positively impacted by population density, immigration, literacy rate, technology. Like here we have phones. So based on that, GDP improves. It's like the economic condition of a country improves, and it affects the GDP of a country. So, and we also saw that coastline plays a major impact. Like countries which have big coastlines have high, or the countries which has coastline, for that matter, makes like has higher impact on its economy, because it's able to do trades and have ports, and there are like multiple factors affecting that as well. So having a coastline may affect positively towards GDP. And we also saw that literacy and how healthcare facilities affect on GDP. Like we have birth rate. Like for example, we have infant mortality and birth rate. So having higher good healthcare systems would affect GDP in a positive way. Uh, we also figured out that location of a country. For example, we have North America and all the Western European region, Asian top, like some parts of Asia, like India, Northern India, China. All this come in the temperate region, where we saw that GDP is like tend to increase more, or they have good conditions or favorable conditions to trade or to grow crops or to mine. Like likewise, they have like positive impact on GDP. So all these conditions, all these factors uh, are like basically in our based on our data set are responsible for GDP. And apart from that, I would like to suggest that these are like few factors, because there are like many other factors which are complexly correlated or complexly in relationship with GDP. So I would like to suggest or recommend as well for future, for prediction and model building, that if we have like more variables or more factors, or if we have correct relationship of GDP with other factors and how complexly it is related to the GDP, then we could actually predict more accurately. But based on this, we actually got like about 90%. So it's like these are like major factors which affect GDP in a positive way or in a negative way. So for conclusion, I would like to say that our effort was just to present the statistical tools and analysis what we had. And thank you.
Thank you.